Hello everyone and welcome back to Boater Plays Something, where we are reading Thera Awakening, the prequel novella to Stonekeep, written by Steve Jackson and David Pulver. Apologies to David Pulver, whose name I will have to check on the title sheet every single time, and no such reminders needed for Steve Jackson. Anyway, when we last left off, we had our heroes were taking refuge at Fort Thunder, and Rathe learned that his mother was perhaps a rune magician, certainly a priestess of Thera, and that the blood of magicians of Thera run through his veins. And they will be getting ready to head out and see what they're doing next. So, come on and join me as we continue. I'm Boater. Let's read something. I just realized that that's the first time this series that I've given my like intro phrase. I haven't actually said let's play something yet with them. Anyway, Thera Awakening by Steve Jackson and David Pulver. Chapter 3. Rathe woke to Lorig's hand shaking his shoulder. "Time to get up, sir," the soldier said. Rathe sat up. He felt well rested. His head still felt tender, but aside from that, it was the first proper night's sleep, in a bed, that he'd had in a week. The dim light of early morning was coming from the barred window of the tower. Around him, the others were waking up, struggling into their tunics and boots. The tower smelled of sweat and cooking vegetables. "That was a rough night," Tam was saying to Quinn. She glared meaningfully at Lorik. "At least I don't snore like a kettle." "Not much loss," Quinn grumbled. "Kept tossing and turning. I hardly got any sleep. Rune magic drawn in blood. How can we fight that?" How indeed, Rathe thought, but he kept silent. As he waited for breakfast, Rathe studied the map of Caravale. It had been prepared by Stonekeep's master cartographer. Tam had salvaged it from Hoth's body. "You have any dreams, boy?" Orvig asked. He was stirring the stew pot. "No," Rathe answered absently. Then he realized he had dreamed, and suddenly it came back to him. "Well, yes, I saw the broken rune again," he said softly. "Aye? Anything else?" Orvig asked curiously. "Maybe. No voices, but a feeling of, I don't know, wanting? Incompleteness?" He looked at his finger. He was wearing his mother's ring. "That's strange," Rathe said. "What, dreaming of it?" Orvig shook his head. "Hardly, boy. We were talking of the rune until late. I'd be surprised if you didn't." No, not the dream, the ring," Rathe said. He tugged it off, weighing it in his palm, which I would do, except that it's a little tight here, so we'll just leave it there. "It's just that I tied it around my neck. I don't remember putting it on." "Oh well." He shrugged and slipped it back on his finger, which is fortunate, because that's where it still is on here. It fit well, and he liked its feel. Rathe turned back to the map, spreading it out on the table. Fort Thunder was clearly marked, the last outpost on a logging trail that led back south towards Stonekeep. But the same trails also led north and east, deeper into the forest, past the hill where Seth's party had fallen, to within a few miles of the savage villages of Adra and Gotmeg. Barbarous names Rathe had trouble pronouncing. Rathe knew that Seth had hoped to visit them, then perhaps press on to trade for furs and hides with tribes that had never been encountered before. Further east and north, the map was mostly white space, but Rathe had heard the forest called Caravale stretched eastward, gradually giving way to broken badlands and, eventually, the foothills of the mountains called the Shadow's Teeth. At the moment, though, the problem was closer at hand. Rathe traced the route between Fort Thunder and Stonekeep, mentally adding miles and days. Then his finger drifted northward. After breakfast, Rathe rolled up the map and gathered the 3 soldiers and Orvig about him. "I've made a decision," he said. 8 ears pricked up. "I know you've all heard what Orvig found on the mutant insects. The Whispering Death. Runes. That means magic is involved. He paused to let that sink in. The runes are drawn in blood. I think they're controlling the creatures, making them attack our folk, but not animals, or even other races like the dwarves. Except for Orvig, everyone nodded. We've got a problem. Stonekeep needs to know about this soon, before they send anyone else into the Vale unprepared for the creatures. Oh, we whipped him good enough once we knew what we were dealing with, said Quinn belligerently. That we did, said Rathe delicately. It was an exaggeration, but good for morale. But if they're taken by surprise like Seth's party, and us, he mentally added, they'll be ambushed and slaughtered. We have to get word back home, Tam agreed. But what about the dwarf's sister? She flicked a glance at Orvig. If the bugs only eat our kind, she might still be alive. It's possible, Rathe replied. We can't be sure. Gods, said Tam. We're not sure about anything. We lost half the patrol and we still don't even know who sent those things after us. Maybe that girl the watch second saw? Said Lorik. Nah, said Quinn. Why would she warn us? Right, said Rathe. You're right. Tam, Quinn, there's too much Stonekeep needs to find out. That's why we'll split up. Which historically has worked so well in any fantasy setting. Right. Just ask any D&D party how that works. Tam, you'll take Lorik and Quinn and carry word back home. Orvig and I will scout the forest, see if Hoth was right, and if the savage tribes are on the move. Oh, wait a minute, said Tam. She leaned over the table. You're going into the forest alone? We should go with you. There was a chorus of muted agreement from the other two men, but Rathe shook his head. Getting word of the creatures back to Stonekeep is just as important as finding answers. As Tam said, we've two duties, to find out what killed Hoth and the others, but also to warn the keep. He unrolled the map, motioned Tam over. Here we are. His finger stabbed Fort Thunder. And there's Stonekeep. It's a 2-day journey south, but if you move fast and light, you might be able to make it in a day and a half. I'll take Orvig and strike northeast towards the villages here. We'll see if we can find any connection between the savages and the killer mutants. Orvig's no soldier, Tam said. I am. I should go with you. Rathe shook his head. You're next in command after me. I need you in charge. Orvig may not be a soldier, but he knows the forest. And Rathe smiled grimly. And if he tastes bad to the bugs, I won't be taking him into any more danger than you'll face. He rose to his feet. No more questions. We march in an hour. It's not about Orvig being in danger. It's about him being able to watch your back because you are in danger. Anyway. They made their preparations and divided the supplies they could carry, Rathe making sure each of them had 3 javelins and a torch besides the normal kit. Afterwards, Rathe took Tam aside. I'm depending on you to get through, Rathe told her. Those things may still be out there. Keep a fire at night, just in case. They found us easily enough in the dark last time. You just take care of yourself, said Tam. I'll manage Lorik and Quinn. She stared out into the forest depths. I'm going home. You're going deeper into the Vale. We'll be careful, Rathe said. I might even be able to link up with you in a day or so. Yeah, I might even be able to link up with you in a day or so if we don't find anything. But if I don't make it back in time, just try to convince the council not to do anything rash. I'm no speaker. Just tell them what happened, Rathe said. You'll do fine. I still don't like it, Tam said. Be careful, Rathe. You too. See you in Stonekeep. They clasped hands, and then Tam turned away. In Stonekeep, she said. Lorik, Quinn, let's move out. Rathe and Orvig set out to the northeast, following the trail. The mud had dried out, making walking easier, and the weather remained good, neither warm nor cool. The forest didn't seem especially dangerous in the morning light, but each of them kept a wary eye on the sky. So far, the Whispering Death had struck twice at night, but what did that prove? Morning was fading to afternoon when they reached the grassy knoll where the creatures had attacked them. Orvig had told them that the bodies of Hoth and the other soldiers lay in a single shallow grave, marked by only a small standing stone with their names scratched on it. Rathe decided not to visit. There was nothing there for him. Aye, Orvig agreed. We've dug too many graves lately. He shrugged. The mood was grim, and they spoke little. Although neither would speak of it, each feared the coming night. They circled the battlefield and pressed on, but only half a mile away, Rathe stopped. Oh, gods, he said slowly. Take a look at this. Tracks? Said Orvig. His voice was eager. He was glad to be looking for Jhen. Not tracks, said Rathe. Orvig stepped forward over a fallen log and brushed a hanging spiderweb out of his face. He peered down where Rathe was pointing. It was an empty snakeskin, dry, white, and harmless. But the snake that had shed it would have been easily 20 foot long. Rathe examined the skin. It seemed fairly fresh, at least it did not fall apart to his touch. The pattern was complex, huge diamonds alternating with stripes. He'd never seen anything like it. Each man looked at each other. Giant snakes, Orvig finally said. Fine, boy. Oh, fine. He shook his head as if it was Rathe's fault. They moved on, but this time they watched the underbrush as well as the sky. A few minutes down the trail, Rathe had an irresistible thought. He turned, grinning, and clapped a grumbling Orvig on the shoulder. Maybe they eat giant insects, he said cheerfully. After a few more miles of hard marching, they found a likely campsite near a rocky outcropping that Rathe hoped would be defensible, and began gathering deadwood for the fire. That night, they took turns standing watch. But despite Rathe's fears, nothing more lethal than mosquitoes assailed them, nor did he remember any more strange dreams. They broke camp early the next day. Mosquitoes can be lethal, depending on what they carry. Soon they passed the hill where the Seth party had fallen, and by mid-afternoon had penetrated deep into the forest, where the cedar and juniper trees grew thick, almost obscuring the faint trail. Hoth's map was now... Sorry, I'm going to start that paragraph again. I realized that I thought there was a period when it was actually a comma. Soon they passed the hill where the Seth party had fallen, and by mid-afternoon they'd penetrated deep into the forest, where the cedar and juniper trees grew thick, almost obscuring the faint trail. Hoth's map was now nearly useless. Rathe had little idea how far they'd traveled. They'd long since left Stonekeep's logging trails. Now they followed other tracks, made, they guessed, by deer, or possibly by savages themselves. It was late in the day, and only faint shafts of sunlight pierced the wooden canopy. Rathe's legs were beginning to ache. He thought of calling a halt and looking for a campsite when he noticed that the trees seemed to thin ahead. Motioning Orvig forward, he brushed aside a tree branch, and found himself on the edge of a wide clearing. In the midst of it was a cluster of rude huts, surrounded by vegetable plots. There were fenced pens for pigs or fowl, and a well in the center of the village, and yet... There's no one here, Rathe decided. Not even animals. He didn't like the look of this deserted, silent village. With a start, he realized it reminded him of the hill where they'd found Seth's party. There was no smell of death, but something felt wrong, very wrong. Is this Adra or Gothmeg? I think Adra, lad, said Orvig. He grimaced. I'd expected to see smoke from the cookfire's fires. I'd expected to see smoke from the cookfire's fires. I'd expected to see smoke from their cookfires. Campfires? From the cooking. Some time ago. Why can't I? Fire. I'd expected to see smoke from their cookfires. Some time ago. He shook his head. To speak truth, I'd been a bit worried we'd gotten lost and missed the place. But it's where it should be. Let's look around. Rathe loosened his sword. But cautiously, there may still be someone here. Word fire. I don't know exactly what sounds preceding a trilled R I have so many problems with, but some are totally fine. I haven't inspected and figured out what sounds it is, and tried to figure out where my mouth is immediately preceding where my tongue is immediately preceding where it needs to be for trilling an R. So anyway, they walked slowly into the village. If you could call 24 huts a village, Rathe thought. But no one challenged them. The only signs of life were a few dragonflies that buzzed lazily about, sunning themselves on fence posts. Adra's huts were of wattle and daub construction. To Rathe, used to the solidity of Stonekeep and the sturdy wood frontier forts, they seemed disturbingly fragile. Many of the buildings and fences were in poor repair, but whether the gaps and debris were from neglect, bad weather, or deliberate vandalism, neither could tell. Rathe tugged at the door blanket of the nearest hut. Nothing happened. He pulled the blanket aside and entered, ducking to pass through the low doorway. Inside, it smelled faintly of dung and charcoal. The floor was packed earth, with a fire pit near the back. The only furniture was a wooden bench. On it stood 2 pottery jars. A third lay on the ground, broken into a dozen pieces. Kernels were scattered about it. Corn? Rathe turned to survey the room, then jumped as he saw staring eyes looking into his own. He stepped backward, bringing his weapon up as the dwarf watched from outside in alarm. Then he laughed, seeing that the threatening faces were just painted wood. Only masks, he said, reaching above the doorframe to remove one. Masks? Stepping hastily into the hut, Orvig slapped his hand away. Rathe drew back obediently, looking his puzzlement. We'll say looking in puzzlement. Don't touch, the dwarf said grimly. He looked up, wincing as his neck popped. These are spirit masks. What do they do? Jhen spoke of them once. The savages carve them when someone dies. Leaves them over the door for a month to keep the ghosts away. Touching one is bad luck, they say. He tugged at his beard. 3 deaths in one house, within a month. Not good at all. The pair left the hut and entered its neighbor. Inside, they found no signs of life or recent occupancy, but 4 spirit masks hung above the entrance. The third hut they checked was the same. I don't like it, Rathe said, almost whispering. Is everyone here dead? Maybe so, said Orvig. But if so, who made the masks? He glanced at the position of the sun. I think we should split up. If it's all the same to you, boy, I'd rather not be here by nightfall. Rathe nodded. You take the east end, he said. I'll take the west. Be careful. Rathe moved from hut to hut, opening the blanket that covered each door, peering inside, sometimes entering. But in each, the story was the same. No sign of life, but no sign of death. Nothing at all, save the silent masks. Orvig was getting frustrated. He'd searched a half-dozen huts, and the story was the same. Nothing. Oh, he'd found spirit masks aplenty, broken pottery, ashes from fire pits, a broken hatchet. He wondered if Rathe had found anything. He was beginning to think that the village had been deliberately looted, and yet it was also tidy, as if someone had been through afterward. Well, there was still one more hut to check. He pushed his way past the hut's entrance and immediately noticed a faint pungent smell, as if something, fishes perhaps, had been cooked there. Orvig allowed himself a faint smile. Perhaps the village wasn't deserted after all. Rathe had found a pyramid of skulls. They were stacked in a pig pen behind a hut on the western edge of the village. Nearly a dozen skills, a grisly monument of bleach white bone. Rathe had found a pyramid of skulls. They were stacked in a pig pen behind a hut on the western edge of the village. Nearly a dozen skulls, a grisly monument of bleached white bone. It's a lot more than a dozen. In front, facing the forest, was planted a wooden pole or staff about 3 feet long and a finger's breadth thick. Attached to it was a leather thong from which hung a spirit mask. The entire length of the pole was carved with runes. Although the day was warm, Rathe shivered. Was he seeing the fate of Adra's villagers? But there weren't enough skulls. There are in the picture, but... Rathe climbed over the pen's fence and squinted at the runes on the staff. Some of the symbols seemed familiar. The middle one seemed like an abstracted version of the rune in his dream, on the ring he now wore. Others were totally unfamiliar. But he felt drawn to them all. He had a sudden desire to touch the staff, to possess it, but the very strength of the feeling made him doubt it. That's the first smart response to, this magic seems to be drawing me in. And just to consciously realize, it seems to be drawing me in. Maybe I'd better not let it. Look at Mr. Smarty Pants over here. Everyone knew magic was treacherous. There was something odd about the skulls, too. They seemed almost malformed. Gingerly, Rathe reached down and grasped one of the ivory domes, taking care not to unbalance the pyramid and bring them all down. He traced its texture with his fingers. It felt dry but curiously brittle. It was intact, showing no sign of damage, and lighter than he thought it would be, but then he'd never held a human skull before. Then he realized he was wrong. The slope of the forehead was subtly different, the jaw enlarged, the teeth pointed. Not human, Rathe realized, but far too large to be a Sharga skull. Certainly not a dwarf. What did that leave? It had to belong to a Throg. He examined others. They were Throg skulls, all right. That made him feel a bit better, but not much. What were they doing here in a human village? Had the Whispering Death been here? Involuntarily, Rathe glanced at the sky. The sun was low and veiled in cloud. but dusk was still at least an hour away. The only living thing he saw was a distant bird. It looked like a hawk, or maybe even an eagle, wheeling over the forest. It was time to find Orvig, he decided. Maybe the dwarf would know what the skulls meant. Then Rathe heard the sound. Was it a kind of rustling? Or slithering? It was behind him on the other side of the nearest hut. Getting closer. A vision of the giant snakeskin popped into his mind. 20 feet long, he thought. His sword whispered from its scabbard, and he crouched down, taking cover behind the pile of skulls. Seconds passed like hours. Hunkered down, he waited for it to appear, darting quick glances over his shoulder. Gods, he thought, what if it's gone after Orvig? He heard a pebble move. Time to risk it. Moving slowly, so as to not alarm the snake, he peered around the pile, and found himself staring into wide green eyes only inches from his own, and a long knife thrusting for his heart. As Orvig entered the hut, wood chips crunched slowly underfoot, softly underfoot. Shards of broken pottery, old fish bones, and one leather sandal with a broken strap lay in the corner. A cloak made entirely of black feathers hung from a peg in the wall, next to a pair of dangling fish hooks. Suspended from the ceiling was a wicker cage imprisoning the tiny skeleton of a bird. There were no spirit masks hanging above this entrance. That made sense to Orvig. This was clearly an abode of the living, not the dead. But it was strange, disturbing. To a dwarf used to the tidy order of Stonekeep, the hut was chaos. Orvig examined the room. A russet blanket was spread out in the middle of the room, and on it was spread the debris of a meal, fish bones, crumbs, and nutshells. Ants scurried about, gathering them up. The hut reeked of burnt charcoal, fish, and herbal smells Orvig couldn't quite place. A single spear stood propped against the wall just inside the entrance. Orvig hefted it experimentally. It was tipped with flint rather than iron, its ash shaft decorated with owl feathers, but the workmanship seemed good. Carved on the spear's blade were runes that even Orvig could recognize. That even Orvig could recognize. They spelled death. Hurriedly, he put it back down. Orvig nodded to himself. Herbs, skeletons, runes. The room reeked of magic. Careful not to trip over the clutter, the dwarf stepped over to a wooden wash tub. It was filled with dirty water, and plucked the bag from the stool. It was made of doeskin, drawn tight with a leather thong. He weighed it. It felt heavy, and he could feel several things inside. Stones? He fumbled with the knot. That mentions a bag in the wash tub. I apologize for... Bag on the stool. Is that mentioned earlier in here, or is there just a bag on a stool now? Nope. A bag on the stool. Alright. Anyway, another scene break. Wait! Rathe cried. He parried the thrust with his sword, then backpedaled. Calandra, wait! This is the first time the full name Calandra has been said, and it's not her telling him her name. Editing. You! The woman exclaimed. She stepped back, then slipped her knife into a belt sheath. Sorry, Rathe replied. He sheathed his own blade, feeling foolish. I thought you were a snake. Oh, Cal said. She brushed sweat-soaked brown locks out of her eyes. That's what you were sneaking around for. I'd feared you'd try to stick me and I'd have to spit you. Sure, we'll go Irish for Kel. See how I can keep separation between Irish and Scottish and just piss everybody off. I heard a snake nearby, Rathe said, and we saw a big snakeskin a few miles away. He shrugged, feeling foolish. Twice now Cal had surprised him. At least this time she seemed nearly as startled as he was. Stupid of me. Maybe, Cal said, but maybe not. We get big ones in these parts, sure. Frightened you did it. What did it look like? No, that's not gonna work. I need to pick Irish or Scottish, otherwise they're just gonna... I'm not gonna worry about Kel's accent. Maybe, Kel said, but maybe not. We get big ones like in these parts, sure. Frightened you did it. What did it look like? I'll just play with the vowels a little bit and we'll see what happens. Gray, like any snakeskin, Rathe said shortly. Somehow he got the impression Kel was playing with him, but it's not important. He gestured around him. Is this your village? I be Calandra of Adra, she said formally. Sorry, I be Calandra of Adra, she said formally. And this, and Rathe sensed an edge to her voice, is Adra. Let me do that paragraph again. I be Calandra of Adra, she said formally. And this, and Rathe sensed an edge to her voice, is Adra. She stepped forward and sat down on the pigpen's fence next to him. And you are a Wraith of Stonekeep, but I know little else. Save that I'm glad that you still live. Reflexively, Rathe touched his forehead. The wound still itched. The young woman nodded. You fell, and yet you survived. Be grateful. Few who bear the scars of whispering death can say that. You saw our battle? Asked Rathe. He'd supposed that she'd left after warning them. A little. From the forest shelter. Heard Mara, though. I came back when the same Mara were gone. Saw your folk dragging you off. Still, better than I thought you did. That is, still, better than I thought, comma, you did. So, you did better than I thought. Just in case my awful attempts at an accent were, throwing that off. You know, better than I thought you did. Anyway, still, better than I thought you did. Still, you did better than I thought. She favored him with a grim smile. It was a good match. Many of us didn't make it, said Rathe. He gave her a challenging look. Was it sport to you? Sport? Kel was on her feet, eyes blazing, her fingers curled around her knife. Wait, said Rathe hurriedly. I mean, no offense, lady. I know your warning saved many lives. But the girl's temper crested as quickly as it had broken. No, she said, sitting back down. You have the right of it, Rathe. I should have helped, maybe, but one short blade would have been scant use in the storm of wings and iron. But as I said, your keep-bred warriors did well enough, once you took over as war chief. And this time she did smile, though it flickered across her face almost too fast to catch. Rathe liked what he saw. Where are your warriors, she asked. She may have a nice smile, Rathe told himself, but I know nothing about her. On patrol, he compromised. He cast for a question of his own. But tell me, this village, Adra, where is everyone, Kel? The woman's eyes narrowed. Are you blind to the masks? She exclaimed. Less than a moon has passed, so their spirits still linger here. They're dead, Rathe guessed. Perceptive, bud. Did I not say? Kel replied, which is basically her saying, perceptive, bud. Her eyes burned dangerously, and Rathe felt the urge to back away. But instead, her hot gaze left him and turned inward. My kin and clan. I carved the masks. Their remains I dragged to the hollow hills, the carrion that the Samara scorned to take. And each day the masks ask me, what have you done, Calandra? Why do you live? I share your grief, Rathe said. He wanted to ask Kel how she survived. Instead, he extended his hand. After a hesitation, Kel clasped it, her shoulders shaking. Her hand was slightly smaller than his own. She started to say it, then she froze. Calandra? Rathe looked up, wondering if she'd spotted something. No, your ring, she said. She grasped his wrist, turned his hand over until she could see the gleaming black stone. What is that rune? It's a family heirloom. He shrugged, feeling reluctant to have to explain the dreams. I wasn't wearing it last time. But tell me, he waved to the bone pyramid, what are those skulls doing here? They're throgs, aren't they? Rathe was unprepared for the look of savage satisfaction that lit up Kel's face. Unamakar warriors, she said, who were careless. Unamakar? The word meant nothing to Rathe. Kel got up, began pacing back and forth. A Throg tribe from the Broken Lands to the north, but now they lay claim to the forest. Were they your people's enemies? Rathe asked. No, Kel said. She lowered her voice, but Rathe could still feel the anger in it. Not then, anyway. Start that again, because getting the right emotion. No! Kel said. She lowered her voice, but Rathe could feel the anger in it. Not then, anyway. Some skirmishes over the hunt, but some trade too. We had a treaty. But a month ago, the Whispering Death came. I was gathering herbs in the wood. When I returned, all were dead. The creatures were feeding on the bodies. But what of the Throgs? She gave a harsh laugh. While the Saemara fed, the Throgs came like maggots to a rotting corpse. Our hunters could have stood against the Throgs or fled into the forest and harried them, but against the Whispering Death, they fell. We all fell. All but me. Hunters could have stood against the Throgs. Slightly different emphasis there. Anyway, where did they come from? The Death? Oh, once they lived in the mountains, preying on small game and mountain goats. But now someone controls them. The rune underneath, Rathe exclaimed. Oh, you saw that, did you? Said Kel. She gave him an appraising look. Aye, the blood rune. But why do you think the Throgs control them? They might just be scavengers, Rathe searched for an analogy, like jackals following the tiger. No, the Unimakar are on the move. Bands of their warriors roam the north woods, which they claim as their own. Had you continued your journey, Rathe, you would have surely met them. And sometimes Saemara land among the war parties. I've seen Unimakar warriors speak to a Saemara, as a man does to a dog. And... She paused. I have heard their tale from their own lips. What do you mean? Rathe asked. He felt a sudden chill. There was something in her tone. But it was at Gothmeg village, you see. I went there, afterwards, to warn them to rouse their warriors. Silly of me, Rathe. Gothmeg is closer to Throglands. Of course the Unimakar and the Saemara had already come and gone. But I found 2 Throgs who had stayed to loot the dead. She walked over to a pile of skulls, lifted one from the bottom of the heap, caressed it. He was my first. He told me as much as he could. Aye. And then he wished to tell me more, for his life ended when his words did. Orvig worked patiently with the bag, his stubby fingers deftly teasing at the tightly knotted leather thongs. Finally he had it open, its contents spilled into his hands. They were not runes, but rather 24 discs of bone, each carved with a... They were not stones, but rather 24 discs of bone, each carved with a spidery rune. Even in the dim light of the hut, Orvig recognized them. This was a complete set of the Ithark, the runes of lore, shared by both human and dwarf magicers. While they could not breach the future's veil, it was said that the wise could use them to reveal past and present. Orvig knew it took power to carve the Ithark, and to make the death runes he had seen on the spear. Nor would such objects be left unguarded. He stood in a magicer's lair. Could this be the seat of his enemy, the one who would cause Jhen to be lost? He thought of a bloody rune drawn on a hard insect shell and drew his short sword. The rasp of the blade was answered by a soft hiss. I hunt them now, said Kel, her words soft but sharp as a blade. She had returned the skull to the pile. It's a strange sensation, Rathe, stalking by daylight rather than night. For the Throgs and their beasts prefer the dark and the deep and are drowsy under the sun, not like hunting animals. But 11 warriors I have sent to join their god. 2 have lived long enough to question. Her fingers stroked her sheathed knife. But I learned little enough. I don't know their tongue, and they knew little of human speech. Perhaps the next one will be different. Rathe felt repelled by her vindictiveness, yet in his mind he could see the broken bodies of Jhen, Hoth, and Nam, and the mangled corpses of the Seth party. The forest is cruel, he told himself. What if Orvig or Tam had fallen? Would he make a shrine to vengeance, heaping the skulls of his foes? Heaping the skulls of his foes. Is that why I'm here? The thought disturbed him. I'm after Jhen, he told himself, and answers. Have you heard of a dwarf woman, maybe hiding from the Throgs or taken by them? What? Kalantra gazed away from the grinning trophies. Oh, your dwarf sister. Not I. When I came upon your folk on the hill, they'd been dead some hours. I heard you speaking of her, that's all. What was her name, Rathe? As Wraith's words were cut short by a sudden yell. Help! Oh, sorry. Help! 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 Single words I cannot do in an accent. I need to, like, build up to it. Whatever. The dwarf was calling for aid. With a series of fires. Never mind. It's Orvig! Rathe exclaimed, leaping to his feet. He drew his sword and ran towards the noise. The girl followed on his heels. The shouting was coming from a small hut at the eastern edge of the village. Rathe thrust its curtain open and stopped dead. Orvig was backed into the hut's far corner. A wooden stool held in one hand as a shield, his sword in the other. In front of him swayed a large serpent, easily twice his height, though its body was no wider than his fist. The mottled snake darted in and out, gliding away from Orvig's sword thrust with frightening ease. It seemed to be playing with him. The dwarf was breathing in short rasps. Rathe! Rathe! Orvig gasped. Snake! Stay put, Rathe said. He stepped forward, slipping the shield off his back. The snake slid back, turned to meet him, its yellow eyes gleaming in the hut's gloom. Rathe was ready. He intended to block the snake with the shield and slice off its head with a single blow. If that failed, they could pin it between them. He raised his shield high and felt Kel's hand on his shoulder. Stop! Don't kill him! Calandra said. She squeezed past him and waggled a finger at the snake. That's stupid! Can't you tell a dwarf from a throg? As Rathe and Orvig looked on, the snake cocked its head and hissed at her, then moved slowly forward. Kel knelt, letting it wrap itself around her arm, its tongue licking delicately at her face. He is Akeshi, Calandra said. She turned to face Rathe. The keeper of my spirit. Thank you very much for watching today, everybody. That has been Chapter 3 of Thera Awakening. There are 4 chapters left to go. Again, this is a somewhat short book. We're already almost halfway through. Yeah. Almost. So we're doing pretty well. So if you want to see more, remember to subscribe down below. Leave me a comment and let me know what you thought of this episode. I ate just prior to doing this, so apparently there was like digestive noises and gas and stuff, and I really hope that the mic didn't pick it up that much. If so, I am so sorry. But definitely know not to record right after eating next time. Anyway, if you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. If I will accept thumbs down for reasons of gastrointestinal stuff, just leave me a comment saying so. That's awful. That's terrible. Why am I still talking? You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.com/Boaterbug, support at Patreon and Ko-Fi.com/Boaterbug, and watch live at Twitch.tv/Boaterbug. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good one, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.